This is class number 31 in our series on money. Let me, if I might, just by asking a few questions, just see who's picking up what and who's learning what. This particular portion of Scripture, in Matthew chapter 4, it says here, next the devil took him to the peak of a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. He said, I'll give them all to you, he said, if you will kneel down and worship me. Anybody tell me why Jesus wasn't interested in this offer? Huh?
Because he already owned it all.
He owned the world. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. But that's not what was on offer. What was on offer was all the kingdoms of this world.
Because he was part of a kingdom already.
All right, but he gets offered all of these ones.
This is better.
Why does he not want them?
I look at it as a betrayal to his father.
Any other reason?
Because they're broken.
Yep, they don't work. None of them work. These were all under Adam's sin consciousness, under the fall, and so we've everything here from monarchy to theism, or to multiplicity of gods, to communism, to fascism, to socialisms, to democracies. None of them work. They're all man's efforts at self-governance. The reason man fails at his self-governance is why? Sin consciousness. He's supposed to be under God's. He's hardwired to be under God's blessing, or God's governance, which is a theocracy. And so it just doesn't work. He wasn't interested. When he offered him all of these broken kingdoms, these broken systems, that's not what he wanted. He wasn't interested in any of them. He came to fix that. That was the problem. It says here in John chapter 18 and verse 36, it says, Jesus answered, my kingdom is not an earthly kingdom. Or in other words, it comes from a different place, different locality. It comes from a different arena. He wasn't interested in what Satan had offered him because it doesn't work. Under sin consciousness, what man had concocted as far as governances are concerned were all wrong, all faulty, because we're all under sin consciousness. Jesus came to restore what Adam lost. You can tell what Adam lost by what Jesus came to restore. What message did Jesus preach? What other message did Jesus preach? None. He didn't preach any other message. That's all he preached. He didn't preach healing. He didn't preach prosperity. He didn't preach any of that. Why did he not preach that?
His kingdom is bad contained within the kingdom.
Say again? It's all in the kingdom. He preached the kingdom and then demonstrated it with healing and so on and so forth. Signs and wonders and his interaction into the present course and current course of nature. But it's all he preached. He told them that's all you got to seek, just it, and everything else comes with it. You don't need anything else. It's all contained. Yes, Bobby?
So the devil's a pretty powerful guy too. I mean, he on earth here. So don't you think he knew that Jesus would reject his offer? I mean, did he really think that Jesus would accept what he was offering?
No, I don't think the devil is a smart. I know he was created in wisdom, the Bible says in Ezekiel 28, but it also says in the book of 1 Corinthians, had the princes of this world understood what they were doing, they would never have crucified Jesus. They would never have done it. They didn't. He can read the book, but he doesn't understand the content.
But he's a former angel.
So, but he's not made in the God class. 1 Corinthians chapter 2 tells us that for you and I to understand God, we've been given the Holy Spirit. And without the Holy Ghost, everything else to the natural man doesn't make sense. I often use the illustration, if I was using an electronics book and I asked you to read, if you can read perfect English, to read the first chapter of the electronics book, you could probably take it and read it perfectly in English. Everything, diode, cathode, the whole lot, DC, AC, alternating currents, the whole lot. You could read the whole chapter. And then I said, so what does that mean? I don't have a clue what it means, but I can read it. And so there's a difference between reading something and understanding what you're reading. The devil didn't understand it. He doesn't have doesn't have the mind of God. He doesn't have the mind of Christ. And so he himself was very ignorant of what was going on. But again, he knew Jesus came here to do something, but he offered him at all if you would just worship him, because whoever you bow your knee to becomes your master. That's all he was looking for. He was looking for lordship over Jesus. But the point we're making is Jesus didn't want it. He didn't come for none of this. He came to fix this. This was the problem. The whole death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, as I said this before, we spend so much time teaching what Jesus done and not why Jesus did it. So the church today many times spend all of their time talking about what Jesus done. And you know what? It's not that it shouldn't be talked about, and it's not that it's not a wonderment of God's goodness and grace, but you got to go on to the why. And so the church need to move on to why he did what he did. He did all of that to do something, and that was to give us or restore to us the kingdom, of which we as believers are ambassadors of that kingdom until it physically, geographically shows up in the millennial kingdom. So all human governance without God fails. And you know what? I said this to you before, and I'll just reiterate it again. Thank God for the American dream and all the aspects of it. But let me just tell you this, it's broken. It may have its element and its foundation in biblical principles, but it's broken. It's man's effort to try and create heaven on earth. That's all it is. And it may be the best of our efforts so far. But as you can see, every 4 years they put one out, take another crowd in, because they're still looking for better governance. People are coming to the border looking for governance. Everyone's looking for better governance. Jesus came to give us back that governance, the kingdom of God. So, we took this up then over the last couple of weeks, so let me get into it if I may. When God said in Genesis 1:28, it says, "And God blessed them and said, be fruitful, multiply, replenish, subdue, and have dominion over the whole earth." The empowerment or ability to do that, to achieve that, to accomplish that, came from a spiritual force. What was it? The blessing. Man could not have done that without the blessing. God blessed them and said, do this. They had to have the blessing in order to be able to do that. That's what the blessing was for. It was the enablement, the empowerment of God to use his presence and his resources on man's behalf and enable man to do exactly what he told him to do. He blessed them. When Adam sinned, what did Adam lose? He lost the blessing. Because he told him in Genesis chapter 3, you're cursed. The ground is cursed. You're going to have to work the ground by the sweat of your brow. Told his wife that because of what she had done, she will now suffer pain in childbearing and so on and so forth. The curse had entered in. So I brought you these definitions here. The blessing really is the favor, the presence, and the resources of God released on man's behalf. That's all it is. It's God's presence, favor, and resources released on man's behalf. And then I wrote down there in the bottom, it is to be endued with power, to be successful, to prosper, to gain wealth, and to live in happiness and fulfillment of purpose. That's what it does. That's the outworking of it. But that's what it is. It's the favor, presence, and the resources of God released on man's behalf. He told Adam, you can have that in order to do this. Adam went independent, got off the rails, and God said, fine, you're on your own. You're going to have to work, and you're going to have to bust yourself now to get any of that thing to work for you. And man now lived without it. Curse, there is no power in curse. The power of a curse is the absence of God's blessing. That's all it is. There's no power in it. It's the absence of power. It's the absence of God's favor, presence, and resources. So we brought this up, and let me run through these slides, and I'll get into what we're doing this morning. So after the flood, very first thing God did was, and God blessed Noah. Right? We're back. In order for him to achieve what he needed to achieve, he blessed him. The only thing that was in here, what's the difference between this blessing on Noah and the blessing that was on Adam? Dominion. He didn't have dominion. He was sin conscious. He was under sin. He was independent of God, and therefore he didn't have that ability to have the dominion that he was intended to have. And so, but God blessed him. That's how you achieve it. God's favor and presence enables you to do it. Then later on in Genesis 12, God found himself a covenant partner, a guy that would believe him. Remember, Adam derailed the whole program. Adam's gone independent. And now God has to, in order to come back into the world and influence it again, he's got to find somebody to work with him by faith. So he finds a guy called Abraham. Now the Lord said unto Abraham, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred, from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I'll bless you, and I'll make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. That is the whole reason for blessing. The whole purpose of being blessed is to be a blessing. The whole purpose of the blessing is not for you to hoard. It's not. It's for you to be what you're meant to be, to do what you were meant to do. I'll bless them that bless thee, curse them that curse thee, or retract the blessing from them, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. That was the whole intent, to get the blessing back into the earth. And then we start to see this process of the blessing moving along from generation to generation, God endeavoring to keep his influence in the earth by showing his favor and his presence and using his resources on behalf of those who would covenant or believe or walk with him by faith. And so we see Isaac. It says in Genesis 25:11, came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac. And Isaac dwelt by the well, and then we started to see his whole life take off with abundant blessing and favor. But Abraham passed it down to Isaac. Isaac then in turn had two sons, and then you know the whole gambit here with these two guys, Esau and Jacob. Esau didn't want it, but Jacob did. And God said, look, I know he did it the wrong way, but he did it by faith. He wanted it more than the other clown wanted it. So if you want it, I'll give it to you. He said, well, you know, he wasn't the firstborn. It's always by faith. Everything you do with God is by faith, always. So it says here, it says, and Father Isaac said on him, come near and kiss me, my son. And he came near and he kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his raiment, and he blessed him. You know that whole story. And he gave the blessing to the firstborn, to Jacob. Of course, when Esau came in, he was livid, and he took off and left. But later on, Jacob endeavors to win this back. And there's a portion of scripture later on where Jacob wrestles with the angel of the Lord, and he wrestles with him the whole night long and won't let go of him. And eventually the angel of the Lord says, hey, for goodness sake, do me a favor, just let me go. And he says, no, I will not let you go until what? You bless me. See, he had done it wrong the first time, but he wanted to get it. He wanted to get it right. And so God blessed him. He wrestled with him, and eventually he blessed him, and he said, I'm going to change your name from Jacob to Israel. And then Israel had 12 kids, and the blessing is going to pass down to them as a people and as a family. Here in Genesis chapter 32 and verse 24, this is where Jacob wrestled with the angel. It says, and Jacob left all alone in the camp, and a man came and wrestled with him until the dawn began to break. That's that episode for those who want to look it up. He just wrestled the whole night long. He wouldn't let go of him. Once he got a hold of him, he thought, I'm not letting go until you bless me. He wanted the blessing. God's presence and favor and resources released on his behalf. In Hosea 12:4 it says, yes, he wrestled with the angel and won. He wept and pleaded for the blessing from him there at Bethel, and met God face to face, and God spoke to him. That's how much he wanted it. They all wanted this thing. They wanted the blessing. It's what made them all different from everybody around him. It's what made Abraham different from everybody around him. It's what made Isaac different from everybody around him. It makes them different. When you operate under a blessing, your life is different, completely. Everybody sees it. This is that portion in Genesis chapter 39 where Joseph, Jacob's son, gets sold into slavery, and he ends up in Potiphar's house. You know the whole story. But what I wanted you to see, it says, I want to highlight it then. It says, and it came to pass, verse 5, from that time that he had made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake, and the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in his house and in his field. I mean, the guy was Blessed. His house was blessed. Blessed, why? Why did Potiphar receive the blessing or receive the aspects of the blessing in his home? Because Joseph worked there. Why do you think your corporation and business do well? Unless, of course, you don't realize it. It's because you're there. Truly. You're blessed. Blessed. It's a powerful spiritual force. And God was trying to get this back into the earth because Adam lost it. And so the only way he could do it was through covenant. It says in Deuteronomy 10 and verse 8, it says, "And at that time the Lord separated the tribe of Levi to bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord." That was their job. "And to stand before the Lord and to minister unto him, and to bless in his name unto this day." The job of the Levite was not just to erect the tabernacle and then disassemble it and move it down the street when they were moving around the desert for 40 years. Their job was to bequeath or to speak forth or to declare what? A blessing. That was their job. So somebody would come up and offer a sacrifice, and then the guy would lay a hand on the sacrifice, lay a hand on the other guy, and then he would transfer the sin from one to the other and bless the other guy then, and the guy would walk out. Their job was to bless. That's the force. And you and I need to understand that as we talk about money, that there's something far more powerful than money. Far more powerful. Far more powerful than anything that any of the governances in this world offer. The greatest thing you can possess is the blessing. You can't possess anything greater than it. It says in number 6 and verse 22, it says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, spake unto Aaron and to his sons, saying, On this wise shall you bless the children of Israel, saying unto them, The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face to shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. And they shall put forth my name upon the children of Israel, and I will bless them." That was their job. They were there to bless. That's all they were there to do. Predominantly to bless. Yes, sir.
So, would grace then be the unconditional love of God, and the blessing be the resources of God that were broken down?
Excuse me.
I'm trying to figure out what the difference is between the blessing and grace. Because by faith we receive grace. And then to have the blessing, which is the greatest, which we talked about, is the greatest resource. I'm just curious, like the difference between
both of them. Grace is God's unmerited favor. God doesn't have to do anything for any of us. He doesn't. Anything we receive from God, we get it because God is gracious. He loves us, not because we loved him, but because he's gracious. He forgives us, not because we deserve it, but because he's gracious. He redeemed us, not because we earned it or because he's gracious. Grace is, the only way I can describe grace is, how many of you have been thinking about the Niagara Falls this morning? Nobody? You weren't thinking of the Niagara Falls this morning? Anybody? How many of you can guess what quantity of water flows over the edge of that thing per second, per hour, per day? Amazingly, it's unfathomable probably. I can't imagine what it's like. The grace of God flowing from God's throne is like that. It's just flowing. That just comes from God. It just flows from God. God is a gracious God. It just flows. And everything that is God is in that flow. Everything. The thing about it is, whether you're aware of it or not doesn't stop it from flowing. It doesn't stop it. And if you stand at the Niagara Fall with an egg cup and say, "Listen, do you mind if I take this? I mean, I hope I don't break the bank if you don't mind. I'm just taking an egg cup full." I'm sure God's looking at if that represented grace, thinking, "You can put a bucket in if you want." So if I put a bucket in, I mean, I put 2 buckets in, is that too much? And he's thinking, for goodness sake, it just flows. blessing is part of that provision of God. So the blessing, God's favor, he doesn't have to give it to us. He doesn't have to bestow that upon anybody, but that's part of that flow. So grace is everything that God extends toward us. That he doesn't have to, but he does because he's God. The blessing is part of it, one of the ingredients, one of the benefits, one of the elements of the grace of God. Does that make sense? But they are different. But just one's the flow and the other are the makeup of what's in it. All right. So their job was to bless. Yes, Doug?
The blessing of a house and the blessing of a business that you indicated, because of one of us might have a blessing in a business, that extends to everyone, even though they are not believers, they aren't living a good life, etc., etc. I'm confused by that. But the city blessed the house of the Pharaoh.
Of Potiphar, yeah. Only because Joseph was there. I mean, everything that Joseph did went right. And because he was doing it right and because God's favor was all over Joseph, it made the other guy look good. And so Potiphar could see that. Potiphar could see that his house, everything about his house and lifestyle and everything went up a grade, not because of his skill, but because he had Joseph working with him. And Joseph had the favor of God all over him.
Okay, so if I have the blessing and I'm running a business on a lot of people, and he's blessed me and he's blessed my business, how does that impact the other people that are there?
Well, firstly, you have to have faith that you have the blessing. There's a lot of people, Christians, that are blessed and they're running around sin conscious and they don't even know that they are. And they spend most of their life trying to gain money as opposed to understanding how to walk in the blessing. Seek from first the kingdom. But if you're an employer or somebody who owns a corporation or a company, then of course, if you're walking in the blessing and God's favor is all over you, and the godliness and the righteousness and the character of God and all that stuff is in you as you walk in that blessing, well, everybody around you is going to see and feel the touch of that in their life. It doesn't mean that they'll go home and they'll be successful in everything they do. They're in a place that's successful because you're in it. They're blessed because you're there.
Like your manager, if you have a manager who runs your business with you, is benefiting from the success of your business. So your
That's my
ability,
association.
yeah, your ability to employ 10 people versus 5 because your business is successful blesses those 10 people.
Yeah. Again, it's let me move down the street on it a little bit because.
It's two different types of blessings, though. I feel like.
Say again.
It's two different kinds of blessing. I mean, we're blessed by the grace of God as a believer, but other people can be blessed as a result of what you're doing in that business. That doesn't mean they're.
No, we're using the same.
Be their own believer.
Say that once more.
They're accountable to be their own believer. It doesn't mean they're a believer by osmosis, is what I'm trying to say.
No, they're not a believer by osmosis. They just happen to be in an environment where God's blessing is there. It's there because you're there. It's there because you're operating in it. Now, you could be there and not operating in it. You could be a sin-conscious, guilty, miserable, mean, stingy, and as tight as anybody else because you don't know who you are or what you have. But for those who do walk in it, do understand it, and do operate in it, when you walk in it, everybody around you feels and witnesses that blessing in their life. But it's for believers. It's for those who have faith in God, period. Are you still with it?
You can be blessed and be in God's favor and not know it.
Yeah.
So how, I mean, give an example of that. Like, how could you be in God's favor and not know it?
Because like everything else, it's all by faith. If you don't believe that you're blessed, if you're sin conscious and you see yourself as unworthy and unholy and unmeritorious, and you're trying to win God because of the way you work or the things you do, then you fail to realize that you're not blessed because of your performance. You're blessed because of Jesus' performance. And there's a lot of Christians that are blessed because they're part of the church, but they don't know they're blessed. And so if you listen to them talk, they try to invoke God to do stuff for them that God's already done. And I'll get to that later, but they're trying to get God to do stuff that God's already done. And it proves that they don't know they're blessed, because they're still trying to get God to do something that God's already done for them. They already have it, but they don't know they have it. Everybody okay? All right, let me just move down the street. Yes?
The point there, a few lessons ago, you said that God's looking for those that seek Him. So He blesses everything regardless of whether you're good or bad. But He's looking for those, through those blessings, to make people seek to learn more.
No, I think we've deviated away from everything here. Let me step everything back, because the questions have taken us out into this idea that God blesses everybody. God doesn't bless everybody. God blessed Adam with the empowerment and the presence and the enablement and the resources to do what He told him to do. Adam lost that. Adam went independent, went sin conscious, and from that moment on, he tried to govern the world, rule, reign, and whatever, to do what he was hardwired to do, but he couldn't do it because he didn't have the blessing. God tried to reintroduce that. And it was with individuals at that particular time. It was with Noah. It was later on. It was with Abraham. Later on, it was with Isaac, and then Jacob, and then it extended down because Jacob had 12 kids, and that extended into. And God wanted to make them a nation, and so when God made them a nation because of a covenant with Abraham, because He said, "I'll bless you, and you bless them, and all families of the earth will be blessed because of you," He blessed that nation, and He gave the Levites the job of being the blessors. That was their job. So the blessing is with this one people. The blessing wasn't with the Philistines. The blessing wasn't with the Romans. It wasn't with anybody else. It was with that nation because they were covenanted to God. And God said, "I'll use this covenant methodology to keep you in good stead with me. And out of that relational connect, covenantally, I'll bless you. And that'll make you different from all the nations in the world." And they were different from everybody else. Not because they were a special people in the sense that they looked different or geographically. I mean, they were living, if you've ever been to Israel, it's just full of rocks. But God blessed them. God's favor was on them. And He prospered them in everything that they'd done. God did it. And only because that they were in covenanted with Him to bless them. That's all. The whole purpose of the covenant was to bless them. Period. That's all it was. Of course, it was a teaching tool to teach them that they were sinful and needed a better governance system later on, but the whole purpose of it all was to bless them. That was it.
So you're saying today believers are those who are blessed?
Yes, sir.
But others are not?
No. No. So what was the point of... anyway, I'll get to it. No, believers. We have something that the rest of the world don't have. We have something that other CEOs don't have. We have something that your neighbor might not have. We have something that, other peoples in our same generation don't have. We have the blessing. And we need to understand. And it's, I told you, this is a kingdom manuscript. This is a constitutional document. And we're part of a kingdom, and that kingdom, everybody in it is blessed. Because of the king. We're all blessed. But if you don't know it, then you just operate like you don't have it. And the devil's done a great job of that. Let me move on here and take you to something here I want you to see. Deuteronomy 28:1, and it says, "It shall come to pass, if you will hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord your God, to observe and to do all the commandments which I command you this day, that the Lord your God will set you on high, above all the nations of the earth. And here's the reason. And all these blessings shall come on thee and overtake thee." He said, if you walk according to the covenantal constitution, because that's what they had back then. You all with me? All they had was the law. But they weren't performing the law to win God's favor. They were performing the law to stay in the place where they could live under the blessing. That's all. You all with me? They were just keeping the law of the covenant to stay under the blessing. That's all it was. It was the blessing they were after. Still with me? All right, let me move on. Numbers 23:7. It says, "And he took up this parable." This is Balaam. The children of Israel are marching around the promised land, or not the promised land, marching around the wilderness, and it looks like they're going to move north and move into other countries. And one of the kings of the area hired this prophet to curse this bunch of people. He was terrified of them. It says, and he took up this parable and said, Balak, the king of Moab, had brought me from Aram, out of the mountains of the east, saying, come, curse me Jacob, and come, defy Israel. And here's what he says, how shall I curse whom God has not cursed? And how shall I defy whom the Lord has not defiled? Balaam says, I can't do that. I can't uncurse them because God blessed them. It's a spiritual force. It's not a natural force. The blessing is a spiritual force. Where does it come from? God. God blessed them in Genesis 1:28. God blessed Abraham. God blessed Noah. God blessed Isaac. God blessed the children of Israel. God blessed them and says if you'll stick in the parameter or under the principles of the covenant, you keep yourself in under the blessing. And that'll make you different from everyone else in the world. And then Balaam was asked to curse the crowd, and as they stood in the mountain and looked down on the plains and saw the children of Israel, every time Balaam opened his mouth to go curse them, because he was paying him to curse them, what came out of his mouth? Blessing. If you go read the narrative over in Numbers 22 and 23, you'll find out that every time Balaam opened his mouth, he blessed them. And the king was so angry, he kept saying, for goodness sake, I'm paying you a fortune to curse this crowd. He goes, I can't. Every time I open my mouth, just a blessing comes out. And then he said, well, what's the deal? And he said, well, I can't curse what God has blessed. If God's blessed them, you can't unbless them. Because blessings come from God. That's just the way it is. I can't do it. Or it says here later on, he says, behold, I have received commandment to bless, and he hath blessed, and I cannot reverse it. People cannot reverse God's blessing on your life. The economy can't reverse it. Hello. The world that we're living in can't take that from you because it doesn't come from the world. The blessing comes from where? From God. It's the favor of God. It's the presence of God. It's the resources of God. And yet the church many times run around as fearful and as fear-filled as the world around them because they don't realize, hey, my source is... Say again? It's God. It's the blessing. But we don't see it. We don't think covenant. We don't think country. We don't think citizenship. We don't think this. We think religion. And that's what's wrong with us. We're totally castrated when it comes to being fruitful, productive. He had blessed, and I cannot reverse it. Psalm 133. Psalmist says, behold how good and how pleasant it is when the brethren dwell together in unity. It's like the precious ointment upon the head that ran down the beard, even down Aaron's beard, right down to the skirts of his garment. As the dew of Hermon, as the dew that descended from the mountain of Zion. It says, for there the Lord commandeth, not a blessing, the blessing. There is only one. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's just the blessing. It's God's blessing. And he says here, when there's unity and they operate together, the brethren, that's the parameter, that's the principles by which if you come in under the jurisdiction of the covenant or its principles, the blessing flows the whole way down, right from the top to the bottom. Everybody in it's blessed. But God commends not a blessing, he commends the blessing. You still with me? Because there is only one.
I have another question.
Yes.
Blessing, I'm looking at your slide. The favor, presence, and resources of God released upon man's behalf.
Yes.
The blessing, as you seek and find and move towards purpose, would be fair to say the revealing of God's blessing to you would be, it would align.
Would be the what?
It would align. The seeking and working towards purpose in order to receive the favor, presence, and resources. God has his plan for you. The earth is unlimited in resources. He's already given us that. right? So to release that on a man's behalf is that, I would imagine, or I'm questioning, is that associated with the more that you're able to tap into would be the more that you're able to find you're on purpose, right? And you're on God's purpose. And if you're on God's purpose, He's opening and revealing. And
God's purpose for your life,
yes.
the ability for that purpose to be fulfilled, requires the blessing. It requires it. Because it's part of God's purpose, and the resources of God, the abilities of God, the graces of God are provided to you to enable and empower you to do that. That's what He did to Adam. It's what He did to Noah. It's what He did to any of these guys. He blessed them and told them what they would do. Or He told them their purpose, but in order for them to fulfill their purpose, He blessed them. So, yes, if you want to fulfill your purpose, or God's purpose for your life, you need the blessing.
I think you can be under the blessing and not be working towards purpose.
Of course. It's a whole, the church has to go through a whole optic shift. How many of you have ever, this is the first time maybe somebody addressed this whole issue for you guys? And yes, the most important, the whole Bible is about this one thing. The scripture from cover to cover, from the beginning to the end, is all about blessing. The whole thing. God trying to work with man in order to enable him to fulfill the intent God has for them, their purpose, by operating with the blessing. That's all. And you need the blessing to do it. So it says here in 1 Samuel 4. And let me tell you, this is a very interesting story. I love this narrative, this whole story. The children of Israel, the presence of God with the children of Israel was typified in the Ark of the Covenant. When the Ark moved, and when the pillar of cloud moved or the pillar of fire moved, they packed everything up and they moved the Ark and the tabernacle with it. Do you remember that story? And so they went around for 40 years, and every time the cloud had moved, they moved with it. So they packed everything up and they moved the Ark to the next place, and when the cloud had stopped, they'd stop and then set up the whole regalia again, and then they'd bless the thing and anoint the place, and the anointing would come down, and in the Holy of Holies, where the mercy seat was on top of the Ark of the Covenant, God's presence was there. So if you came and visited them during the day, you would see a pillar of cloud coming down from the sky down onto the Ark of the Covenant, and that cloud sheltered them from the sun during the day and kept them cool. And then at night, if you saw them at nighttime, you'd see a pillar of fire likewise doing the exact same, and it'd light up the whole camp, and it would keep them warm in the cold desert evenings. It was just an amazing provision of God. But the presence of God was typified in the Ark. So they just followed the Ark around. Wherever the Ark went, that's where they went, because God was represented by that Ark. Everybody with me? So here they start to get away from God. And as a result of that, they go out against the Philistines to battle. And they lose. And they're shocked. And they got a good hiding. And so the next day they thought, you know what? That was a tough battle yesterday. We lost a lot of men. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to go send to Shiloh, grab the Ark, and get the Levites to march the Ark into the battle with us. I'll tell you, these Philistines, when they see the Ark, they'll go in big trouble, because God is with us. And so that's what they've done. So they go in and grab the Ark, and they march it, and they go to battle against the Philistines the next day. So here's the narrative. It says, and when the people were come into the camp, the elders of Israel said, wherefore hath the Lord smitten us today before the Philistines? Let us fetch the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord out of Shiloh unto us, that when it cometh among us, it may save us out of the hand of our enemies. I mean, that was the logic. Hey, just bring the Ark, for goodness sake. Bring God's presence into the place. They can't beat us. So, it says, and when the Philistines, who were maybe across the valley, heard the shout, because when the Ark appeared, when the Levites arrived with the Ark, the army started to roar and shout with excitement. So the Philistines heard it. When the Philistines heard the noise and the shout, they said, "What meaneth the noise of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews?" And they understood that the ark of the Lord was come into the camp. And the Philistines were afraid. And they said, "God is in the camp." And they said, "Woe unto us, for there has not been such a thing heretofore. Woe unto us! Who shall deliver us out of the hand of these mighty gods?" He goes on to say, "These are the gods that smote the Egyptians with all the plagues in the wilderness." So they were afraid of their life. They were afraid of life because they heard the other guy, across the valley screaming and shouting with glee because the presence of God showed up in the form of the ark. They thought, hey, you can't beat us. You can't beat us when God's with us. So they go to battle the next day. And the Philistines beat the tar out of them. Not just beat the tar out of them, but the actual Philistines take the ark as well. When we talk about beating them, the guys trotted off down the street with the ark as well. So it says here, the Philistine says, "Be strong and quick yourselves like men." They were terrified. "O ye Philistines, that ye be not servants unto the Hebrews, that they have been to you. Quick yourselves like men and fight." And the Philistines fought, and Israel was smitten, and they fled every man into his tent, and there was a great slaughter, for there fell in Israel 30,000 men. And the ark of God was taken, and the two sons of Eli, who was the high priest, Hophni and Phinehas, were slain. So it didn't work out the way they thought. They brought the ark in. Now, they're not serving God. They're at this particular time. That's why they got beat the first time. But they thought, we'll bring the ark in. We rub the lamp. God will work for us. Went in, got beat. Ended up losing 30,000 men, and they lost the ark. So the ark goes down the street to the Philistines' place. So the Philistines now have the ark. It's going to stay with the Philistines for 7 months. And if you read the story, it's a great story. The Philistines take the ark and they don't know where to put it. So they take it into the temple of their god, a god called Dagon. And if you read the story, they bring it in and they park it in the temple where Dagon is. But when they come back in the morning, Dagon is on his nose in front of the ark. The big statue, huge edifice, fell over on its nose, and it's lying prostrate in front of the ark. So they go in and they pull it back up, and they put it back up. And they do this several times, and then they come back in one morning, and not alone is it broke, but his head's broke and his hands are cut off. And they were terrified at this stage. They thought, no, we'll get rid of this thing. And as well as that, they all ended up with piles. Everybody had piles. They had piles of piles. They were, you know what I mean by piles? Hemorrhoids. They all had them. They were in agony. The whole city, Ashdod, Ascalon, the whole lot of them. It went from one city. They took it and said, no, we don't want this. And they moved it down the street to another Philistine city. And as soon as it arrived there, lo and behold, they all ended up sore, in pain, in agony. And then they moved it down to another one. And everywhere it went, this plague followed them. So the whole nation of the Philistines, are having major troubles. 7 months of this stuff, and eventually they say, we want rid of it. So would you. Cream wasn't enough at that stage. This was a plague. So they don't know what to do with it. So what they do is they put it on a cart, and they put gold emblems of mice, because there was a famine went on as well, and then they made gold figurines of hemorrhoids as well. 5 of them, 1 for each city. 5 mice, 1 for each city. And they put it on the ark as well. And they said, well, what are we going to do with it? And they said, well, we don't know. We just need to get rid of it. So they put 2 cows on it. cows don't pull stuff like that, and cows have their babies. And they said, look, if these cows pull it away, we know it's God. Or their God has taken it away. But we need to get rid of it. So they put these 2 cows on, and the cows, although the little baby cows were, lowing for them, these 2 mother cows walked down the street and took the ark out of the Philistine camp. Well, as they went down the road, and eventually they came where the Israelites were, they saw the ark and they couldn't believe it. Here's these 2 cows walking with this ark on the back. And they thought, oh my goodness, this is awesome. And cut a long story short, they don't know what to do with it now, because it's been gone 7 months and they don't know whether to touch it or whatever. So they grab the ark and they bring it to a house of a guy called Abinadab. And they park it in his garage on the side of the house. And they say, we don't know what to do with it, you look after it. And it stayed in Abinadab's garage for 20 years. 20 years it was there. Not alone was it there 20 years, but it was after that 20 years that they asked for a king. Remember that whole story where they went to Samuel and said, we want a king, we want to be like everybody else. Why do you think they were looking for a king?
Because they were being ruled without God.
Because God wasn't around. He was in an ark in Abinadab's garage on the side of the house in another town in another place. And they didn't have God around for 20 years, and after a while, when they don't feel the presence of God in it, you automatically start to lean towards being like everybody else around you. I'm going to show you this now in the scriptures. Not alone was it there for 20 years, but after 20 years, they go to Samuel the prophet and say, we want a king. And he goes, no, you don't want a king. They say, no, we want a king. We want to be like every other place. We want to have our own governance. And he goes, no, that's going to be a big disappointment if you do that. And so they insist on it, and God says, fine, they didn't reject you, they rejected me, give them their king. But warn them, this is what's going to happen when you get a king. So he gives them a king. And the king he gives them is a guy called Saul. So he gives them Saul. Saul was in power for how long? He was in power for 40 years. And he never once looked for the ark. It was parked up in Abinadab's garage somewhere else. And for the 40 years Saul was king, he never looked for it either.
That's who David played the guitar for, or whatever it was?
Yeah. Not for a wonder he was having trouble. So let me show you this. Actually, if you want to open your Bibles in 1 Samuel chapter 6, please. Everybody with me so far? All right. And this might help you understand what went on here and why. Because a lot of times we read this stuff and we don't realize what's going on. But what had happened was they had lost the presence of God. It was typified in the ark and they had lost it. Somebody read chapter 6 and verse 1, would you please? Just that one verse.
Now the ark of the Lord had been in the territory of the Philistines for 7 months.
Okay. Now if you read that narrative in chapter 6, it talks about the hemorrhoids and all of the other stuff that goes on, and them trying to get rid of the ark and fire it down the street. Somebody read chapter 7, and would you read verses 1 and 2, please?
And the men of Jeram came and took the ark of the Lord and brought it into the house of Abinadab on the hill, and they consecrated his son Elzir to watch over the ark of the Lord. From the day that the ark remained at Jeram, the time was long, for it was 20 years, and all the house of Israel mourned after the Lord.
Now, if you were to read on and go into chapter 8, you'll find they come to Samuel and they ask for a king. The reason they're asking for a king is because they don't have the presence of God anymore. And they want to be just like everybody else around them. And it's because God's not there. But you know what? They carry on the sacrifices. They still had the tabernacle. They still kept doing their stuff. They still kept doing all their offerings on a daily basis. They still went through all the rituals. The problem was God wasn't in the tabernacle. He was in an ark in Abinadab's house up on a hill in another place. And they never bothered to look for it. It's what religion does. God's not even in the place. God's not even there. And yet they carry out their rituals week in, week out, Sunday in, Sunday out, and they keep going through their stuff, and they're no different than the people in the world because God's not with them. His presence isn't there. But they just keep on going. I said this to you before, and I'll say it again. The scariest place in the world to be is where God was. You don't need to park yourself in somewhere where God was. Well, God, 50 years ago, God did. Thank God for what God did 50 years ago. You do not want to park yourself where God was. You want to be where God is. And the church many times are just carrying out religious rhetoric because truly, they're just, His presence isn't in some of the stuff that we do. However, let me move on. So it's 20 years. Somebody go to 1 Samuel 14. Saul, he gives him Saul. Saul becomes the king, the very first king of Israel, and he was a bad one. 1 Samuel chapter 14, and this was the only time that Saul had an inkling to go and get the tabernacle, or to go and get the ark, but he didn't. He refrained. Somebody read verse 18 and 19.
Saul said to Ahijah, bring the ark of God. At that time it was with the Israelites. While Saul was talking to the priest, tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand.
So he was going to get it because they were having trouble with the Philistines again. And then he had a change of heart. And he said, nah, don't bother, leave it. So go to Acts chapter 13 real quickly. Acts the 13th chapter. Just let me show you how long Saul was king. Acts 13. And will somebody read verse 20 and to 22, please.
Before we jump there, at the end of this chapter where he said, "Nah, don't get me."
Yeah.
It says, "So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battles spread beyond Beth-Aven." So I mean, even though they didn't have the ark in the place of the tabernacle or use it, Lord was still watching over them.
They were covenanted. Many times God did what he did because he was covenanted to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Right, so I'm saying Samuel is saying the Lord was still with us even though we didn't have the ark, right?
That's correct, yes. And there was some element of God's favor there with them at the time to preserve them, but nonetheless, they didn't use the ark. They didn't have the presence of God. Acts chapter 13, will somebody read verse 20 and to 22?
All this took about 450 years. After this, God gave them judges until the time of Samuel the prophet. Then the people asked for a king, and he gave them Saul, son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin, who ruled 40 years. After removing Saul, he made David their king. God testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart.
Okay.
He will do everything I want him to do.
So Saul was king for 40 years. Where's the ark? It's still back in Abinadab's house. It has been for the last 60 years. After Saul was killed in battle, him and Jonathan in a battle, it took David 11 years before all of the children of Israel accepted David. Because Saul had so marred the tribes against Israel, or against David, and they'd been out chasing them and hunting them, so that when David did become king, only a fraction of them saw him as king, and a whole bunch didn't. You often read that verse, and the children of Issachar knew what to do. They were a tribe who sat down and thought, what are we all doing? We're all split here. God has made this guy the king. We all need to submit. And they all came and submitted to David. That was 11 years after David had become king after Saul. So the Ark of the Covenant, the blessing typified in the Ark, has been in Abinadab's house how long? How many?
71.
Nearly 71 years. They never looked for it. It's been
Did David get it?
Oh, David went after it. As soon as they made David king, the first thing David did was, we got to get the ark. Why? The blessing. We got to get the blessing back in Jerusalem. We got to get the blessing back in the center of our community, back in the center of our Optic. Yes, sir.
Dancing with his underwear as they bring it back in.
Yes, that's what we're going to see now. Yes, sir.
More of a rhetorical question, but what's the real difference today? Seems like the same. We got virus, we got churches that aren't really, sharing the blessing, and you got false leadership.
That's the reality of religion. You can be a believer, born again of the Spirit of God, and not know that you're the blessed. And you can act just the same as everybody else does. You can whine and be afraid and moan and groan and complain, rub the lamp, try to get God to do stuff that God's already done. And the fact that you ask God to do it proves you don't even know that He's done it, and the devil is laughing up his sleeve thinking they don't even know who they are. You're right. There is no difference. But what the point being is, you can be blessed and still not walk in it. And that's what's wrong with the church.
So people will walk around the desert for 40 years and never lost the blessing. They just didn't know they had it.
They didn't fully understand what it was. And that crowd wouldn't go into the promised land anyway because they wouldn't exercise faith.
That goes back to his point, that the church has it and it doesn't know what it is.
Yes, it had sin consciousness. You couldn't get the Egyptian thinking out of their head, so they wouldn't go to where God wanted them to go. And so He marched them around till they all died. The church many times is still walking around sin conscious. I have no idea. So let me go over to 2 Samuel chapter 6 real quickly and finish this off. 2 Samuel chapter 6, and here's David. If you read, you can read it yourself today. David goes after the ark. Somebody read verses 1 through 3, if you would. 2 Samuel chapter 6, please. 1 through 4.
Now David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. David arose and went with all the people who were with him to Baal-Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the very name of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned above the cherubim. They placed the ark of God on a new cart, that they might bring it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, and Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were leading the new cart. So they brought it with the ark of God from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, and Ahio was walking ahead of the ark.
Now you know the story. It rocked a little bit. Uzziah put his hand out to steady it, and what happened? And with that, everybody dropped everything, and David said, get rid of it. We don't know what. And they parked it. It was out of Abinadab's house. They now parked it in the house of Obed-Edom, another character. So he opened his up and over door in his garage, and they rolled this thing into his house. And if you read the narrative there, it was in the house of Obed-Edom for 3 months. And somebody just read verse 10 and 12, 10 through 12.
And David was unwilling to let the ark of the Lord into the city of David with him, but David took it inside the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. Thus the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. Now, through what?
Keep going. That next verse, please.
Now it was told King David, saying, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him on account of the ark of God. David went and brought the ark from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with gladness.
Okay. David eventually found out why it happened the first time, because they did it wrong. The priests were the only ones that were allowed to touch the ark. The guy wasn't a priest. He touched the ark and he died. And then they parked it. And then David went back to the city of David and he thought, what am I going to do? I don't know how to get this thing here. And then somebody came and says, That guy Obed-Edom, everything, the guy's business has gone off the rails. Everything, God is blessing him. You can imagine, Abinadab's house must have been blessed for 70 odd years. Now Obed-Edom's house is blessed, and David says, we got to get it. And eventually he finds out what they did wrong. They go get the ark, and when David goes down to where Obed-Edom was, David took off his crown, he took off his scepter, he took off his robes, he took off all his kingly garb, and he danced like a madman the whole way from Obed-Edom's house to the city of Jerusalem in his underwear. Just danced. He danced and danced and danced and danced and danced and danced because David knew something that people didn't know. He was bringing the blessing back to Jerusalem. And it wasn't about his crown, and it wasn't about his scepter or his robes or his position. David danced like everybody should understand that we are what we are not because of the position we're in, but because of the blessing of God. And of course, when he danced in and his wife saw him, she said, you shouldn't dance like that. You're a king. David said, no, I'm not a king. I'm only where I'm at because of the blessing of God. And David brought that thing back to Jerusalem, and they had worship at that little tent for 24 hours a day. So you'd always hear them in Jerusalem. You'd hear them worshiping that ark 24 hours a day until he built the temple. Solomon built the temple later. But you want to know why David danced? David danced because for 70 years the blessing had not been in and front and center in the nation of Israel. And David brought it back into the city. And the blessing was on the children of Israel once again, front and center.